Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about industry analysis and specifically looking at the five forces. The five forces model was developed by this dude, Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, also evil genius, and I'll talk about why I think he's an evil genius. And he wrote this book in 1980 called Competitive Strategy, and it basically reshaped not just the research of strategy, but the entire discipline of management. And it really was a pivotal idea in the history, the academic approach of management, and it's reshaped management philosophy ever since then. If you're going to read one book in the management oeuvre, then I would highly encourage it to be Competitive Strategy. It is an enlightening book, although incredibly dry and boring. The five forces model essentially says that there are five forces that determine how the value in an industry, which I represent here, that circle is all the value that exists within an industry, the return on investment that exists within an industry. How is that split up amongst the different players in the industry? And according to Porter, there are five forces that influence this. The first is the power of sellers. And when we talk about sellers, what we mean by that is businesses, companies, firms, competitors, the people that are trying to devise strategy. If you own a business, you'd be the seller. That's what we mean by sellers. The next force that influences how this value is split up is the bargaining power of buyers. Buyers are customers, consumers. When you go to the grocery store, you are a buyer. When you buy a car, you are a buyer. Next, we have the bargaining power of suppliers. And suppliers are the people that provide resources, technology, labor. And then we have the threat of new entrants. And new entrants are entrepreneurs, innovators, startups, anyone that's not currently in the industry but could be. And then also the threat of substitutes. And substitutes are alternative products and services. They don't do the exact same thing as the product or service in the industry, but they do something kind of similar. And so buyers have the option of going to substitutes. Now, Michael Porter was getting a dual degree in both economics and management at Harvard, and his colleagues in the economics department were doing research on how do you design government policy in such a way to maximize competition within an industry. Because when people talk about capitalism and all the benefits of capitalism, it's all about competition, right? It's competition that provides efficiency, productivity, innovation. So if we want to create the most value for our society, if we want to create the most value, especially for buyers, which is you and me, then we need to create the perfectly competitive industry. And economists were talking about how do we design industries so they're super, super competitive. And what they came to was this conclusion, that a perfectly competitive industry looks like this. We have buyers, sellers, and suppliers all getting a pretty equal share of the pie. There's a lot of sellers in the industry, and they're not very powerful. So they're all about the same power. They're all jockeying for position. They're all fighting each other. Suppliers are more concentrated and more powerful than sellers. And then buyers are the most concentrated and the most powerful. And so buyers are, because they're concentrated, because they're powerful, they're able to play sellers off against each other and make sure they're getting the value that they deserve. The other thing about the industry is that it has these permeable borders. So it's really easy for new entrants to come in and challenge existing sellers. So if existing sellers in the market, or their prices are too high, they're not delivering the quality or the functionality that buyers want, then it's really easy for entrepreneurs to step in and start competing with them. On the other side, you'll also notice it's really easy for buyers to leave the industry and go to substitutes. And then finally, it's really easy for suppliers to sell directly to buyers, something we call forward integration. So if sellers ever get a little bit too greedy, a little bit lazy, we have these powerful suppliers that can step into the industry and start selling directly to buyers. And in that way, they act as a check on the power of sellers. And so this is what a perfect industry looks like to economists, where you have a lot of sellers competing against each other. You have powerful suppliers that act as a credible threat against those sellers if they start to take too much of the value for themselves. You have a credible threat of new entrants to come in and challenge existing businesses, existing sellers. The buyers are concentrated and relatively powerful, and if they ever don't like what's going on in the industry, they've got a lot of other substitutes that they can go to, and it's really easy to do that. Now, why I call Michael Porter Evil Genius Michael Porter is because he took research that was designed specifically for the public good, to try and to be used to try and create the most value for society, to empower buyers and suppliers and against sellers and keep everything a fair playing field. And he took that research and he turned it on its head. And he said, businesses can use this to design strategy in order to structure industries in a way so that sellers get the most power. And so this is what Michael Porter sees as the perfect industry. We still have buyers, suppliers, and sellers. Sellers are getting a much bigger chunk of the return on investment in an industry. How are they doing this? Well, first of all, there's only a few sellers, and they're very powerful, and they're not equally powerful. You have one clear leader in the industry, and then maybe a couple other hanger-ons, but it's a concentrated seller industry with a clear power dynamic. Suppliers, on the other hand, are weak, and they're less concentrated than the sellers. So there's more suppliers than there are sellers. And the same thing with buyers. There's a lot of very weak buyers, so sellers can play them off each other. As you can see, there's very high borders around this industry, so it's really hard for new entrants to come in and challenge existing sellers. And it's really difficult for buyers to get out of the industry and use substitutes. And then finally, it's really hard for suppliers to forward integrate and sell directly to buyers. And so for sellers, this is what the perfect industry looks like. And this is essentially Michael Porter's plan or model. He took the public policy research that economists were doing on how to make the most competitive industry and pivoted to how businesses can use that information to make an industry, to structure an industry that is most effective for them. One thing I want you to be really aware of is that we're talking about an industry level analysis. So the industry, all the sellers are in the same industry, right? This isn't an analysis that is unique to each business. It's an analysis which is unique to the industry as a whole. We're going to talk about each of these 5 forces in detail. We're going to start with substitutes. We've talked a lot about substitutes last time in our last class, so I think it makes sense to start there. A substitute is any product that performs the functional, emotional, or social task of the original product or service. And substitutes pose a threat to industry return on investment. So an example of a substitute is I put gasoline in my car every week so that I can drive to school and drive home and groceries and everything else. I could, if I wanted, start putting electricity in my car, and that would be a substitute. So I'm using gasoline to power my car. I could use electricity to power my car. So these are substitutes of one another. Substitutes are, by definition, less efficient or effective than the original product. So if I wanted to start using electricity for my car, it wouldn't have as much of a range. It takes a lot longer to charge an electric car as opposed to just filling up a tank of gas. It's not always easy to find charging stations. So I could start using electricity to power my car, but it would be more inconvenient than using gasoline. So buyers will switch when the cost of the substitute combined with the loss of efficiency and effectiveness is less than the cost of the original product, which is a way of saying that gasoline costs me about 16 cents a mile to power my car, and it would cost about 4 cents a mile to power my car with electricity. And so it's about a quarter of the price to power my car with electricity. That's still not enough savings to justify the inconvenience for me. So as soon as, if gas were to double in price and suddenly I'm paying 32 cents a mile and electricity is still only 4 cents a mile, maybe that would justify switching and all those kind of inefficiencies that I was talking about. But the main reason, I mean, I would definitely start putting electricity in my car tomorrow if I could, but the reason I don't, the reason I can't, is that my car does not take electricity, right? I can't just plug my Honda CR-V in and drive it to school. And so in order to start using electricity to get to school, I would have to buy an electric car. And that's what we call a switching cost. I have this technology that burns gasoline. If I want to start using electricity, I'm gonna have to put a really big upfront investment in buying an electric car. And that's what we call a switching cost. I'm gonna have to switch from the old industry, gasoline, to the new industry, electricity. High switching costs prevent buyers from using substitutes. John Oliver did a really good takedown on mobile home parks, and one thing one reason that mobile home parks can be so profitable is that once people buy a mobile home, they own the mobile home, but they're only renting the plot of land, but it's really hard to move mobile homes. A lot of times they're not actually really designed for it. They kind of fall apart. And so once you put your mobile home on a space in a mobile home park, the landlord has a lot of control, a lot of power. They can jack up your rent. And what are you going to do? You own this house. You have to put it somewhere. It's stuck there. So they can't switch to a different mobile home park. It's difficult to sell old mobile homes. People would rather just buy new ones and put them on their own plot. And so it's hard to get rid of the mobile home if you want to move to an apartment, a condo, a house, whatever. And so once people buy a mobile home and put it in a mobile home park, they're kind of locked in there. And that prevents them from using substitutes. Switching costs can arise from having to buy new equipment. So this is actually some industries, this is their whole model, right? With razor blades for shaving, they sell the handle really cheap or they give it to you for free, and then they make all their money selling you razor blades. And if their razor blades ever get too expensive or whatever, then you have to go out and buy a new shaving handle. That would be a low switching cost. I have an electric toothbrush, and I got my electric toothbrush for a steal. I think I got it for like 15 or 20 bucks, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then I figured out the heads cost like 10 bucks each as well, right? So I'm spending like $40 or $50 a year on toothbrush heads now. And if I wanted to switch to a different, if I wanted to start using a different electric toothbrush, then I would have to buy a whole new handle. That's a switching cost. Video game consoles do this as well, that they sell you the console up front, and they can often sell it at a loss even, and then you only buy video games that work with that console. Switching costs can also arise from having to learn new technology. This is a guilty confession of mine, but all of my amazing graphics that you see in my PowerPoints, I do all of my graphic editing in Microsoft Paint, and the reason I do that is because I know how to use Paint. I've been using it for decades, literally, and so it's really easy and intuitive for me to get what I want from it. Now there's a lot that Paint can't do. I could start using like Photoshop, but man, I've opened up Photoshop and it is very confusing to me, and I would have to like sit down and learn how to use Photoshop, and so that's a switching cost. Switching costs can arise from convenience. So Apple is really good at integrating all of their products together so that, you know, you've got your Apple Watch and it syncs perfectly with your iPhone, which syncs perfectly with your MacBook, and all these things work together so well. If you want to go out and get a Droid, then your Apple Watch isn't going to work as well, and it's not going to interact as effectively with your MacBook, right? I used to have a time machine, or time capsule, which is a super convenient device where it automatically backs up your computer, your MacBook over Wi-Fi, and it's just like super convenient. You don't even have to think about it. The only problem is it doesn't back up your information, it backs up the entire system. So when my MacBook finally crashed and I wanted to access the information, I had to use another MacBook. I couldn't go out and buy a PC laptop to access that information because it wouldn't work, right? And so basically with the time capsule, they're setting you up to buy another MacBook. If your MacBook crashes, hey, you've got it all backed up. But to access that data, you're going to need another MacBook. So I actually had to borrow a MacBook and download all the information and switch it to my PC, which was a huge pain. And that's on purpose. Another example of switching costs is potential loss of information. So one of the reasons that I was so hesitant to quit social media for so long is that I had a lot of my pictures on social media, and that was the only place I had them. And I was worried that if I quit Facebook, I'd lose all my albums and all my pictures. And you can request all your pictures from Facebook, but they don't make it easy, right? You have to I can't remember what you have to do, but you have to send in a formal request. It's not like you can just download them directly from the site, which obviously is technologically possible, right? They purposely make it difficult to get all of your data off of Facebook so that you're less likely to quit. Okay, so that's threat of substitutes, and in order to discourage substitutes, we want buyers to have really high switching costs, so it's expensive for them to switch from one industry to another, just like I'd have to go out and buy a Tesla to switch from gasoline power to electric power. That's an expensive switching cost. The next thing we're going to talk about is new entrants. New entrants or new competitors will enter an industry when the return on investment exceeds the cost of entry barriers. And entry barriers are anything that prevents a new competitor from coming into the industry. So this can be things like the cost of technology. If you have to build, say, a factory, that's going to be really expensive. Economies of scale, where existing competitors are making so much of something that they can make it much cheaper than you. Brand awareness and customer loyalty. All of these things prevent new competitors from coming in. We're going to focus specifically on two entry barriers: government regulation and access to distribution channels. Government regulation is one of the most powerful, or can be one of the most powerful influences on entry barriers. So for example, people complain about building new developments in San Francisco. San Francisco is in desperate need of housing, and yet to build new developments is this lengthy process where you have to go through all this government review, go through all these permits, pay all this money, and so it's very difficult. Those all represent entry barriers to come in and offer new housing in San Francisco. A liquor license in San Francisco costs $250K. So if you want to open up a bar and start competing with the existing bars in San Francisco, you're going to need $250,000 just to get the liquor license. If you want to be a degree offering institution, then you need to go through all these hoops and get accredited so that the government will recognize your degree and pay for and be willing to give you things like federal aid, which most universities, public and private, depend on. Some industries have very low entry barriers. So if I want to be an executive coach, I can just call myself an executive coach and then start charging people for it. I don't need to do any certification. I don't need to do anything. I can just be an executive coach, which, by the way, if you know anyone that's looking for an executive coach, I'm a very good executive coach. What else we got? Oh, if I want to make an app, I can just do that in my bedroom, on my computer. I don't need to ask anyone, get permission, get permits, sign regulations, anything like that. If you want to sell crafts on Etsy, you can go ahead and do that, and you don't need government approval. And so there are some industries where it's very difficult to get into the industry because of government regulation, and then there are some industries where it's very easy to get in. And in order to have a competitive industry, we want it to be easy for new people to come into the industry. An example of using government regulation to prevent new entrants into an industry is patent trolling. So we have government regulation about intellectual property and patents and who owns what and who can use it. And so existing competitors can sue new entrants for infringing upon their patents. And a lot of times it doesn't even matter if the person is actually infringing upon the patent or not, because it's really expensive to defend yourself against this. And so the idea isn't that, hey, this person's actually using our patent and taking advantage of our technology. It's that, well, either way, we can sue them for it. They're not going to be able to defend themselves, and then we'll win. An example of this is Apple submitted a patent for rounded corners. They said that they had invented rounded corners. Obviously, they know that one of the things they offer is innovative technology, and so they're using government regulation to try to keep out new competitors. Restrictive regulation can often serve incumbents. So we saw this in the taxi industry before Uber and Lyft, that there was just incredibly high regulation on taxi services, limo services. It was incredibly highly regulated. And the purpose of that was there were only a few taxis around, and the taxi companies wanted to be very powerful, wanted to lock down that industry, and wanted to prevent competition. And they were very, very effective at that. And that's one of the reasons that the service for taxis was so bad before Uber and Lyft, and then also why they were so expensive. Another threat to, or another entry barrier is access to distribution channels. Amazon is a really good example of this. If I want to sell basically any product, then I'm going to have to sell it on Amazon, right? And Amazon has a lot of control over that distribution channel. And one thing they do is they pay attention to data on what are the most profitable products that they sell, and then they start making their own versions of them, and they start putting them at the very front of the page. So like, for example, when I search for an Oxford shirt, Amazon has their own brand of clothing lines called Good Threads. And when I search Oxford shirts, this is one of the first things that pops up. It's near the top of the page. It's pushing their own product. And so if I'm trying to sell Oxfords, I'm competing with Amazon, who is not only selling Oxfords, but they own the store that sells Oxfords too. And they're obviously going to be pushing their own products. Net neutrality concerns the rules of the biggest distribution channel, which is the internet. So if you're not familiar with net neutrality essentially says this, that say there's some like different websites you go to. Say you stream media at Netflix, on YouTube, and then also on Hulu. And currently right now, it doesn't matter which website I use, I'm paying the same rate, right? That if I stream a gig of data from Netflix, is going to cost me the same as if I stream a gig of information from Hulu. Now, let's just say hypothetically that my internet service provider, Comcast, has a relationship with one of these organizations. Say they own a stake in Hulu. What they can do is increase the price of data from Netflix and YouTube so that I actually have to pay more when I'm streaming from Netflix or YouTube than I do when I'm paying from Hulu. And by controlling that distribution channel, they can push customers away from competitors and to themselves. Regulatory capture can influence access to distribution channels. So regulatory capture is when the industry controls the government regulation of that industry. And I think the internet is a really good example of this. So this is Ajit Pai. He's the current head of the FCC. This is an actual picture of him. So if you don't hate him for the net neutrality thing, then you can at least hate him for this. He was former assistant general counsel for Verizon, one of the largest internet service providers, and he overturned net neutrality. He said that no, that if companies want, they can have differential pricing for websites. So we see this influence where government regulation can actually be used as a tool to prevent entrepreneurship, to prevent innovation from coming in when it is captured by the existing competitors within that industry.